There were bond defaults that was sort of in the cards last week or the week before. There were some concerns about whether or not the Russians would be able to get the money together, and frankly, banks would be able to process it. They were given a license or an exemption to allow them to do just that. So the default did not happen. At least it hasn't happened yet.
And, as we're watching the currency there, when the ban on SWIFT, which is the processing and the ability of Bank A to coordinate and communicate with Bank B, it was done on several Russian banks, but not all the Russian banks. But we were told there'd be a huge economic impact. What do you see happening there now?
Well, the de-swifting, as they say, I was never one that thought it was that in itself would have a significant economic impact. But the other aspects of the sanctions and the export restrictions, I think, have had an economic impact that have been quite significant. The swifting issue, of course, makes life very, very inconvenient for those who want to use banks in Russia and do international trade. But frankly, the fact that the banks themselves have been sanctioned, let alone the other sort of parts of the economy that have been restricted, that's significantly more impactful to the Russian economy, the Russian people, than the removal from SWIFT.
And one thing that hasn't been talked about, I think, enough is there are a number of multinational companies that were operating in Russia prior to the conflict, and many of them have decided to pull out, and there's massive losses being posted. McDonald's is an example, but the list goes on. What's going to happen in the next couple of months, and why aren't we seeing perhaps more of an economic fallout from these multinational companies?
Well, I think that economic fallout with respect to the departure of those companies, which I think is now numbering over 700 companies that have left or suspended operations or somehow limited their exposure to Russia, I think that will happen over time. It's not going to happen immediately because I think that many of them are acting in order to cushion the blow to their employees. But over time, as they have left, as other sort of components of the Russian economy have ground to if not a standstill, certainly significantly less efficiently run than it was, as they're being reduced to, as their ability to get inputs from Western supply chains and whatnot have been reduced as well, that will have a significant impact on sort of the broader economic growth, economic trajectory of Russia.
The big banks in the U.S. and across Europe who have exposure to Russia, can they survive with this sort of, I don't want to say default, but they're not going to be able to do business with Russia. There's still outstanding liabilities they still have to own up to. They can't just stop everything, can they?
No, I think you're right. I think some institutions will decide to stay. Many will go. I think what you've seen is that many of the Western companies that have left, banks or otherwise, are willing to face write-offs. British Petroleum, BP, had a multi-billion-dollar write-off because of its activities in Russia, which is basically just leaving. So it will certainly not be free to leave Russia because of the exposure. But I do think many of these companies, financial institutions or others, will do so.
So the delisting of many of these Russian companies, we haven't heard officials in Russia say too much about this of late, but okay, so they don't list on the New York Stock Exchange, or they don't list in a certain exchange in Western Europe. Why wouldn't they couldn't they list in Asia, for example?
They could certainly list in Asia. And I think that's one of the questions people have about the next stage of the sanctions. If the West is increasingly going to be unwelcome for Russia, will Russia turn south, either to India, to China or elsewhere? And what will China and India and others be willing to do? Are they going to be willing to step in for the West or not? And what sort of consequences would there be for them if they decided to do that?
If you were in charge of the Russian economy now and you're trying to keep things stable and afloat, are they doing the right things on their end to keep things stable?
In some respects, I think they're doing exactly the right things. I mean, the playbook that they're sort of going out of running plays from is a pretty traditional playbook for economies in sort of this sort of crisis, this sort of shock. So the currency controls are a pretty critical part of this. Limiting flows out, encouraging the use of the ruble. This is very, very common. It increases sort of the artificial sort of strength of the ruble is sort of what one of the results of this is. But over time, there's only so much you can do with this playbook. And I think that over time, if the inputs are going to dry up with respect to imports from the West, if the ability to export to the West and to the globe is sort of impacted as well for various reasons, be it because production people aren't able to produce in Russia or because people are unwilling to buy from Russia, then the ability for even the most sophisticated technocrats, which people at the Central Bank of Russia are, to sort of soften that blow, I think will be much more reduced in the immediate term.
Right. Now, and if you were advising the White House, they've taken all these measures, all of these steps. They've pretty much done everything they can do, right?
I don't think so. I think there are a couple of things they can do. I mean, I still think they're sort of on maybe a 6 on a scale of 1 to 10 with respect to the strictures of the sanctions. There are certain sectors they, of course, have not gone after. Some of them are quite famous, right? The energy sector being a key one. The Europeans are apparently announcing that they're going to be willing to wean themselves off at least oil in the near term. So I think that's a next sector. The other component is continued enforcement. This is what I was referring to with respect to India, China, or other components of the world economy that may want to continue to trade with Russia. Will there be significant clamp down on them, right? That would sort of increase the exposure to those, negative exposure to those who may want to continue to trade with Russia, sort of provides a sort of escape valve, so to speak, for Russian products.
Yeah, and I think that